An attempt to distinguish one historicism from two, faith or Glaube in history, and thereby to show in some bare way an orientation to Heidegger's thinking, which is sorely lacking in Zizek, as evidenced by his recent interview with, I think it's called something like the How To Academy Part 2 on YouTube. He distinguishes between Kantian transcendentalism and what he calls the Heideggerian supertranscendentalism, which he identifies with a field of intelligibility which constantly changes. So that's not Heidegger's view, and it's totally un-Heideggerian. But we have to demonstrate why there should be a kind of fierce humiliation in Zizek's unconscious, hopefully, because he doesn't realize maybe his unconscious can sense something's wrong, maybe it can't. Unconscious is really unconscious, but hopefully something can work there. So to begin with, Heidegger does not say, put that down positively, that there is forever a situation where there's simply a change in the horizon of intelligibility, so that we can make a kind of analog with the Kantian view, except with the mutatis mutandis, with these changes being made with respect to the specific conditions of Kant's transcendentalism. Of course, so let's take a brief look at the conditions of Kantian transcendentalism. It's basically that we ask, looking at a distinction between primary and secondary qualities as understood in Descartes as extension as a primary quality, something freestanding of its own, reality as itself, and then we compare that to secondary qualities or thinking, or how human beings taken as one species among others, with a perception and with a entry into the real world through their perception, so that we have this problem like dogs see in black and white, humans see with colors. Both are subjective distortions. The real thing is matter with its extension, something like that. And then Kant wants to say, what's the absolute limit here, such that we can speak of how much distortion do we need from the specific entity which is perceiving reality, where we can still have some kind of something deserving to be called a life or experience at all. Something like along those lines. And then by transfer, Zizek thinks Heidegger is giving, these are the bare conditions for anything to be happening at all, which is to say that there should be some intelligibility. There should be some horizon of intelligibility. So what Heidegger's actually, we can get more orientation to what Heidegger's genuine view is through looking at the juxtaposition which I named at the beginning. So first of all, as a student of Leo Strauss, I'm fully familiar with the idea of understanding Heidegger as an historicist. And I endorse all Strauss's attempts to do that. Strauss had a higher degree of, let's say, fear, in the sense of the place where angels fear to tread, in going in, tippy-toeing towards Heidegger, because he had a very great regard for Heidegger as the most thorough and the most passionate thinker alive in his Leo Strauss's time, as the only living great thinker in Strauss's time. I think, according to Strauss, although Strauss thinks highly of a number of thinkers who were alive in his day, but letting that aside, historicism in Strauss is set in contrast to something like a Platonic view, which doesn't take history into account at all. So, as though so there's not a question in Plato of the thinkers throughout the ages have all given different opinions on the highest questions, and then it appears like we have a survey of an endless stream of different opinions of different qualities about what the most important things are, and then something like skepticism can easily set in and say we'll never get to the truth. Under those conditions, which are then in the vanguard or in modernity, when people first became aware of that situation, and then they started to say, but why don't we just go directly again to nature instead of looking at this whole history of the opinions of the thinkers? So you can get this in Eric Vogelin, an account of how this sort of apocalyptic feeling that now we've realized we're making this error of just going from opinion to opinion, and now we're just going to go directly there. And you see this a lot in 18th century thinkers, and in a way going back to the beginning of the Enlightenment, this claim to have a new access to the problems which was never seen before. So in Schelling, in his freedom essay, for instance, this notion of going directly to nature, where nature doesn't mean the same thing for Schelling as it does for a current physicist, but still the same claim in, and you get it in, if you read the introduction to the Spinoza book by Leo Strauss, you see again, basically what we're talking about is this awareness of a certain kind of skepticism with respect to the classical attempt to use speech to then get to the most cogent views in something like a Platonic matter, especially in the legal tradition, legal science, especially in the attempt to find out what summa ratio is, or what reason demands, in the sense of that any law which is against reason is not a law. These kind of continual attempts being given up, some new access which is supposed to be revelatory in a radical way is posed, and this is set off against the tradition. This Heidegger understands as a kind of actualism. So it's like the claim is the actual present ousia, or he says more precisely, ousia somehow stands between availability and absence. But that's not totally crucial right here. But in any way, what Heidegger's calling metaphysics then as this the subject to the questioning of the tradition is set aside in such a way that certain people like Schelling say, no, I'll just go directly to the actual thing instead of worrying about opinions. Some new claims are made. Heidegger says, in this situation, where we find out again this actualism is not really getting us where we want to get, we put our faith in history, meaning what other choice do we have except to look at the origin of our thought under something like the saying that we get in Hannah Arendt when she's quoting Faulkner, saying, the past is not even past. So the idea being certain notions which came part of the thinking of Western Dasein are still with us in some sense. So Aristotle's way of accounting for time in terms of using mathematics, and thinking of time as a series of nunc stances, or now stances marked off by arithmetic quantity. So it's like a certain quantity, something happens, there's a now, a quantity of time passes between that happening and the next now. This kind of thinking, Heidegger, this is one example of something that came into existence historically and then is still in our Dasein. But Heidegger no longer understands the trip back through the history of the West as a trip along this timeline, along this arithmetic timeline, so many years, 2,600 years, but rather that it's still essencing in us now, and we simply don't even, it's a question even what this means that it happened in the past, because it's happening right now. So for Heidegger, the idea of the faith in history is that's his manner of investigating being. That's one of his main manners of investigating the so-called Sein und Zeit, the being in time idea. He does not say and cannot say by his thinking that this is a transcendental situation that will always be there. He simply says we have to have some manner of investigation. Why not? And we have to make some sortie or some attempt. And this is one way to make the attempt, by starting out by observing what seems to be there. What seems to be there is a field of intelligibility. That's how he marks the distinction between what he then, I mean, this is, here's a good subtle point of it, is what Heidegger says is, before Heidegger, taking Heidegger as a title for the thinking of Heidegger, there was never this interpretation of the Greeks as understanding being as availability, presence, Anwesen, real estate, something owned. That being ambiguous because the original word ousia meant something like real estate, except there was no real estate market there, so then it meant like a household with a hearth god. But then it took on a philosophical meaning from within the immediate sense for anyone who had a sense of the language, that was the primary meaning of ousia. It then took on technical meanings within the philosophy of the Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and the Greeks. Within that horizon, without them being fully conscious of it, they determined ousia as availability, so as rather than the way Heidegger, as a feint, as it were, claiming to be doing primary phenomenology, says if you just describe it, it's not at the being or the world isn't really like that. And then he gives a different description. He does not say, and it's true that it is always like this, and these are this horizon of ecstatic intelligibility, and these features will always be so. He just says we must again and again just be starting out, and then we have this problem. And if you look at it formally, the problem is sort of like historicism or actualism. Historicism would be the claim it's always the situation, that the intelligibility that we start with is different, therefore we can never get there. Actualism is the claim that the actuality is always available to us, so we only need to just get there, and it doesn't matter where we came from. And for Heidegger, there's something like this. I give a analog in Nietzsche. So in Nietzsche, when Nietzsche keeps saying, Nietzsche basically says, I'm not an atheist, it's just that es gibt kein Gott. There is no God. There is no truth. So he keeps saying, because there is no truth, that doesn't mean we can then go back to subtruth. Because there is no true opinion, that doesn't mean that we can just go to the false opinions. Because the false opinions are only false so far as we think, so far as we're measuring them by the idea that there's a true opinion. So it all kind of collapses. There's something that's hard to think there. In the same way, the juxtaposition between super transcendentalism as historicism and actualism collapse for Heidegger. So he's in a situation that's a small, or that's, let's say that's a crucial but not exhaustive ground where we can get orientation for understanding the being frage, or the being question. Because that creates a situation where we can no longer see history in the way those two concepts of actual availability of the truth, which was taken for granted sort of for the ancient Athenians, or something like historicism, which doesn't necessarily have to be skepticism, but is for the tradition and still in the university is understood basically as a kind of evolutionism. Like in Kant, the idea that thou canst because thou oughtst means that moral evolution is possible because that's what the archetype says, and we just need to work for it, and it must be possible in the empirical struggle. So I think the idea of improvement through history, which is most clearly seen in Hegel, is also has a wider sweep, where it's a general idea in the progressive of the politics of liberalism. The politics of liberalism is totally founded on the idea, both right and left, the two camps determined from the French Revolution, both right and left, conservative and progressive, simply take different tacks on the idea that things are getting better. So, for instance, there's more literacy, child labor laws in the end of the 19th century got more strict in the dissension between Disraeli and Gladstone. You have all these conflicts of Burkean conservatism. Take it slow. Don't have a revolution. Just try to have incremental progress. We're having progress, but take it slow, the conservatives say. The progressives say, take a risk. We're having progress, but do it faster. You guys are asleep. At least sleep faster. Let's make it happen faster. But both sides in liberalism assume that basically something which in an extreme way is the same as Kant's notion of you can do it because the archetype demands it, because the improvement is possible. So you see how that's a kind of break from maybe the traditional Catholic view, which thinks only in another world can there be a better world, because in this world it will always be certain problems. That's the horizon of liberalism in the big view. So if you listen to this again, I think you can see this juxtaposition between historicism as just without the archetype. Historicism is basically things keep changing, but there's no archetype, so history is just the tale of woes and tears and failures. And then the actualism as the claim that, we have this messianic apocalyptic moment where there may be some terrible things happen, but it's also going to lead to direct knowledge. This is part of the horizon of ideas that Heidegger's working with, and Zizek doesn't see that. So he still keeps not seeing that.